Okay, hello. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Before we get started, I would just like to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the land of the Bedegal people, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My name is Minerva Inwald. I'm a Judith Neilson Postdoctoral Fellow in Contemporary Art at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Thank you for joining us for this session in the Talks in Chinese Humanities series. The series is supported by the China Studies Centre and the Discipline of Chinese Studies at the University of Sydney, the Australian Society for Asian Humanities, and the UNSW Faculty of Arts, Design and Architecture's Judith Neilson Chair of Contemporary Art. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker for today. Fang-Yu Hu is Assistant Professor of History at the California State Polytechnic University, Pomona, where she teaches Chinese, Japanese, and world history classes. She received her PhD in history from the University of California, Santa Cruz in 2015. Professor Hu has published articles in the journal Eras at Monash University, as well as 20th Century China. Her podcast interview on the popular Taiwanese film Cape No. 7 was published in 2021. She has recently published her book, Good Wife, Wife's Mother, Educating Han Taiwanese Girls Under Japanese Rule with the University of Washington Press. So that just came out in September 2024. Her current research focuses on overseas Taiwanese in mainland China and Southeast Asia during the first half of the 20th century. So just before I hand over to Professor Hu today, Professor Hu will give her talk, and then there will be time for questions at the end. Throughout the talk and during the Q&A session, you're welcome to use the Q&A function in Zoom that you'll see at the bottom of your screen to put your questions in so that we can get to them quickly during the Q&A. All right, I'm now going to hand over to Professor Hu.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Inwald, for the introduction. And I want to thank all the sponsors of this talk and to Ping from the Ping Zhang from the China Studies Center for inviting me to give this talk. So today I want to talk about how Han Taiwanese girls learn how to be proper women as colonial subjects in the Japanese Empire from the late 19th to the mid 20th century. Based on 2 chapters of my book, you can see a book cover here, Good Wife, Wife's Mother, published very recently by University of Washington Press. I hope to show how Japanese colonial officials try to turn Taiwanese children into Japanese subjects through a gendered colonial education that reinforced gender and ethnic divisions, although ethnic division was blurred while gender division remained during World War II. Please click next slide, please. Here are the chapters of my book. Chapter 1 contextualizes Taiwan in regional and global history. And then that's introduction. And then chapter 1 talks about the discourse on girls' education and the implementation of the ideal womanhood in the educational system. And then chapter 2, and then for chapter 1, it covers the roughly from 1900 to 1930s. That's chapter 1, sorry. Chapter 2 talks about how Taiwanese responded to this education, looking at about roughly 1920s to 1940s. Chapter 4 looks at the wartime mobilization of schoolgirls from 1937 to 45. Chapter 4 looks at the impact of this education, looking at about 1940s to 1960s. And then the last concluding chapter on colonial nostalgia looks at former students' memory of the educational experiences in the early 20-teens, and then as well as a few teachers' memory from the 1970s. So let me begin with one of my interviewees, Lin Xianyan, whose father owned a mine and whose mother was a teacher. Recalling her training from Taichu Girls Middle School in central Taiwan from 1941 to 44 during World War II, she said, "I was the class president then. The class president had to call on each classmate to help out. It was dark with no electricity, but we had to walk toward the school in the dark and made rice and sushi from this big pot. It was my first time learning how to cook rice in such pot. Rice was scarce then, but we had to make it. While the rice was still hot, we had to make rice balls. It was there where I learned how to make triangular rice balls, onigiri. It was our scarce stuff, but not one of us schoolgirls ate any. We students were obedient then. We wrapped the stuff, and in the early morning, the rice balls were transported to the soldiers by truck. The rice balls were made by every schoolgirl in my school. The task required the labor of the entire school, or else we wouldn't make it in time. Goods were scarce then, but we didn't eat any of them. Everyone was junjo, pure, so no one took rice balls home. What we were happy about was that after cooking the rice on the metal pot, we got to eat the remaining rice that was burned at the bottom. It became our breakfast. We were happy to eat it. Next slide, please. Lin's story highlights several features of girls' education under Japanese rule: the virtues of cooking, helping the nation, teamwork, and obedience, with purity that only schoolgirls could exhibit. Working as a team, Lin and her schoolmates put their cooking training to use. So we see here a photo of sixth graders during a cooking lesson at a primary school in southern Taiwan during World War II. Instead of sleeping, Lin and her schoolmates worked through the night to feed soldiers who were fighting, defending the empire. What we see here is how girls in middle school and primary school received, is how girls in these schools receive and practice what is known as the good wife, wise mother training. Next slide, please. Here is a map of Taiwan's administrative units from 1940. Lin was attending school in Taichung, here in the sort of middle, right there. The good wife, wise mother training, called ryōsai kenbo, or 贤妻良母, was an important part of colonial education, with dōka, 同化, meaning assimilation, as the guiding principle of Japanese colonial education. Dōka in Taiwan reveals the contradiction in the Japanese implementation of assimilation, which promised inclusion and equality, yet reinforced exclusion and discrimination. Dōka sought to make everyone in the empire Japanese by teaching the Japanese language and imperial ethics. So, to become Japanese meant speaking Japanese, being ready to contribute to industrialization, and for male subjects to be prepared to serve in the military. This willingness to die for the state was the goal of public education in both the metropole and the colonies. Dōka promises impartiality and equal favor for everyone, but at the same time, colonial officials codify everyone's ethnicity through the household registration, and it couldn't be changed. Furthermore, legal segregation created by Law 63, passed by the Imperial Diet, the Japanese National Legislature, in 1896, gave the Governor General of Taiwan the sole power to pass laws, which meant that no laws from the metropole were effective without his approval. In my book, I argued that assimilation is always gendered, as gender expectations were fundamental to its foundation and success. Gendered assimilation meant that it was impossible for the colonized Taiwanese to become equal to the Japanese colonizers. In the Japanese Empire, women were integral to dōka as good wives, wise mothers. That meant that a woman should support her husband and educate her children at home with the knowledge and skills that she had obtained in school. In Japanese colonial thinking, the home was important because it was the basis of the nation, and a good wife, wise mother was responsible for improving the quality of the home. My talk today focuses on the teaching and practice of this good wife, wise mother ideal among Taiwanese girls under Japanese colonial rule. Now let's briefly discuss this good wife, wise mother ideal. Beginning 1890s in Japan, good wife, wise mother became the official ideal that formed the foundation of girls' education. Japanese colonists introduced this ideal to Taiwan in the same decade. Constructed by engaging with the cult of domesticity in the West from the 19th century, good wife, wise mother was part of a Japanese national, imperial, and colonial project that the Japanese imperialists brought with them to East Asia, to China around 1903 and to Korea in 1906. East Asian leaders and intellectuals found the creation of good wives, wise mothers, through education an essential means to strengthen the nation at the turn of the 20th century. After the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, in which Qing China's loss to Meiji Japan resulted in Taiwan becoming a Japanese colony, the good wife, wise mother concept became Japan's official principle of girls' education, as the central government promulgated an educational ordinance in 1899 defining girls' middle school education in the metropole. Although training in how to be a good wife, wise mother was primarily conducted in middle school in Japan, in Taiwan, the link between motherhood and the nation was emphasized even earlier in primary school. Consider a January 23, 1910 interview published in Taiwan Daily News, the main government-approved newspaper published in both Japanese and classical Chinese from 1898 to 1941. In this article, Mr. Kato, principal of Moko Primary School in Taipei, emphasized the importance of girls' education. Where does a good wife, wise mother come from? If girls' education doesn't flourish, then there will be no good wives, wise mothers. Our school focuses on girls' education. In addition to providing handicraft training, such as sewing, embroidery, artificial flower making, and knitting, our school also teaches imperial ethics, kokugo, which refers to Japanese language, arithmetic, singing, games, classical Chinese, drawing, and other subjects. Instructors must teach all that is necessary for a good wife, wise mother to know. Heavy makeup is forbidden. Gold rings and other expensive accessories and clothing are not allowed. Simplicity and cleanliness are the best. Concerning the matters on foot binding and unbinding feet, the principal frowned suddenly. Taiwan has many harmful customs, with foot binding being the worst. It is torture. Although one's natural body came from her parents, yet it was made to shrink, limiting a girl's mobility. It is heartless. Thus, the Fujian area went on the decline. This is because women bound their feet and could not assist with their husband's agricultural production. Therefore, we cannot delay unbinding these feet. Out of 82 students enrolled in girls' school here, 26 bound their feet, 36 unbound their feet, and 20 have natural feet. Unbinding feet is a more urgent matter than cutting a boy's Manchu hair, that is, shaving half of one's head and braiding the rest. This interview describes the production of ideal wives and mothers as taking place on school grounds, where girls would not only receive homemaking training, but would also acquire literacy and basic knowledge of a wide range of subjects. The school policy on their students' outward appearance suggests the importance of two feminine virtues, thrift and simplicity, virtues that continue to be promoted during World War II. Principal Kato's criticism of foot binding reveals his view of the practice as uncivilized, since it caused harm to girls and women emotionally and physically. His criticism also linked a girl's physical mobility to the economic production of her husband and consequently her community. Principal Kato's remarks illustrate how colonial officials from the earliest days of their rule believed that girls' education, the production of ideal wives and mothers, the civilizing process, and the abandonment of old customs were closely interconnected. So we just talked about some courses in school that Principal Kato's primary school required girls to take. Their curriculum was not unique, and gender training was implemented throughout Taiwan, where girls were trained to be housewives and boys were trained to be skilled workers. In 1897, the Japanese colonial government set up 2 programs for girls and women. Girls ages 8 to 15 were enrolled in the primary school primary educational program, and girls and women ages 15 to 30 were enrolled in the handicrafts program. Later, the colonial government set up primary schools for Taiwanese children in 1898 and required all students, boys and girls, to take 6 years of Japanese language, imperial ethics, essay writing, reading, calligraphy, arithmetic, singing, and physical education. In 1907, essay writing, reading, and calligraphy were removed, and classical Chinese was added, likely to encourage enrollment. Sewing for girls was added for 4-year and 6-year primary schools. For 6-year primary schools, agriculture, handiwork, and commerce were added to the 5th and 6th grade curricula for boys. Even when the colonial government promulgated 2 major educational ordinances in Taiwan in 1919 and 1922, when Japanese history and geography courses were added and changing classical Chinese lessons from a requirement to an elective, gender training remained in place. Boys took vocational learning courses, and girls took sewing and home economics courses. Now, let's talk about Kokugo, the Japanese language course in school, because it was the most important course in the Japanese assimilation project, and it included lessons about gender modernity. In a practical sense, the Japanese language functioned as a tool of communication. Ideologically, Japanese believed that their language contained Japanese spirit, in which good wise mothers were expected to be proficient at and raising and educating their children as loyal subjects. The emphasis on the modernizing effects of an educated girl on her home was illustrated by the Japanese language textbooks assigned in Taiwanese schools, with 5 editions total, published approximately every decade. Next slide, please. An example of this expectation of teaching their family members about the convenience of modern infrastructure can be seen in a 3rd grade language lesson titled Postal Service in the 1st edition of the textbook. Akio, a literate girl, comes home just in time to help her illiterate mother who needs to contact someone with an urgent matter. The accompanying illustration here shows Akio writing the letter and a postal service worker picking up mail from the collection box. The last line in the lesson states, "Since then, the mother has understood the convenience of the postal service." The name Akio and the mother and daughter's clothing reveal that this is a Taiwanese household that has learned how the postal service works. Furthermore, the lesson reveals that colonial officials expected educated girls to facilitate communication by using modern services. So, besides language proficiency, educated Taiwanese girls and women were expected to transmit modern knowledge into their households. Another gender message that was repeated in several lessons in the language textbooks was caring for the sick using Western medicine. Next slide, please. Take the lesson titled Doll's Illness from the 2nd edition, published in 1913 and 14, and the 3rd edition, published in 1923-26, that center around role-playing. In these lessons, Abun, the younger sister, invites her older brother, Agi, to play doctor. Abun welcomes Agi into her house to examine a sick child, which is the doll. The illustration here shows that the doctor practices Western medicine, as indicated by his bowler hat, coat, watch, glasses, and black bag. The presentation of the lesson as a dialogue between siblings shows Taiwanese children how to speak politely using correct Japanese grammar when inviting a guest into one's house. The pretend play demonstrates for Taiwanese students several good behaviors. One is that the older sibling takes care of the younger sibling by playing gender games together, with the girls playing as caregiver of a child, the doll. The other model behavior focuses on gender roles, where medical doctors were almost exclusively men and caregivers were mostly women in early 20th century Taiwan. These lessons also show that Western medicine was part of modernization. In the greater context, soon after colonization began, colonial officials started training medical professionals and promoting Western medicine as part of Japan's scientific colonialism that sought to bring science and civilization to the colonies. Thus, colonial educators used illustrations to reinforce expected gender roles while teaching children the effectiveness of Western medicine, a marker of modernity. With these illustrations we have just seen and others in many language textbooks, Japanese officials sought to link modernity with a society's level of civilization. By depicting Western and Japanese appearances and practices as modern and Taiwanese and Han Taiwanese appearances and customs as backward through a gender lens. Next, let's see. Actually, the next slide, please. Illustrations in the second edition of language textbooks from the 1910s suggest that Han Taiwanese men and boys have begun to westernize and integrate into the empire by adopting Western looks and coexisting with the Japanese. See this illustration from this edition where the Taiwanese boy has the same haircut as the Japanese boy. And the Taiwanese boy also wears a Western hat. So the Japanese boy is wearing yukata, the Japanese clothing. In contrast, women and girls in the first 3 editions of the textbooks, which were used in schools until 1937, are in traditional Han Taiwanese clothes, shoes, and hairstyles, as we see in the previous slides. These illustrations suggest that although Taiwanese men had begun modernizing in the early colonial period, Taiwanese women remained backward and unchanged, perhaps even resistant to change. So these illustrations and the importation of good wife, wise mother from Japan, the metropole, reveal that colonial officials feared possible transgressions by uneducated Han Taiwanese girls and women who would block progress and modernization in Taiwan and thus hurting Japan by slowing down or even destroying the Japanese empire. They believed that girls and women were important in protecting, but could also destroy a society. As early as 1908, Takaki Heitaro, a teacher and principal at Shinjuku Primary School in central Taiwan, warned that Taiwanese women could be the destroyer of civilization in Taiwan. He also suggested that girls' education was a fundamental tool to manage a new colony. To link girls' education with Japan's civilizing mission in Taiwan, Japanese-run periodicals highlighted old customs from Han Taiwanese society, targeting bodily health and foot binding as major obstacles to progress that were even in desperate need of remediation from a civilized country such as Japan. In 1920, in an article published in the journal Women and Family, Hiromatsu Yoshiomi, a teacher at a girls' middle school in Taipei, criticized foot binding as restricting Taiwanese women's movements. He argued that strong and healthy mothers were essential in producing Japanese nationals with strong and healthy bodies, and thus it was important in producing Japanese nationals with strong. It was important to reform Taiwanese people's physical bodies. Foot binding came to symbolize the danger Taiwanese girls and women posed as destroyers of civilization in colonial Taiwan. But actually, the practice had become uncommon by the 1920s. From 1900 to the mid-1910s, the colonial authorities supported a Taiwanese-led anti-foot binding movement, which advocated for those with bound feet to free their feet, and for those with natural feet not to begin the practice. The movement eradicated foot binding among children within 1 generation. So by the mid-1910s, few school-age girls bound their feet. Nevertheless, colonial officials and educators continued to use foot binding as a foil to emphasize their civilizing mission. By depicting colonized women as a symbol of Taiwan's backwardness, the promise of equality and inclusion from dōka became even less attainable as women slowed the assimilation of the Taiwanese to the supposedly superior Japanese civilization. Next slide, please. As Japan expanded its empire and became embroiled in World War II, gender remain important in defining one's role in the empire. From the mid-1930s to 1945, the mobilization of women and children were crucial to the Japanese effort to establish Taiwan as an important base for the expansion of Japanese imperial ambitions. The appointment in September 1936 of Kobayashi Seizo, seen here, the first Governor General of Taiwan with a military background after 18 years of civilian rule, signaled Japan's ambition in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Kobayashi set 3 goals for Taiwan, Kominga, Huangminghua, which means imperial subjectification, second, industrialization, third, southern expansion. The goal of Kominga was to turn the Taiwanese into loyal Japanese imperial subjects. The purpose of industrialization was to transform Taiwan into an important agricultural processing site with links to South China and Southeast Asia. The mission of southern expansion was to make Taiwan the core base for Japan's expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific. These 3 goals foreshadow the role that the Taiwanese, including children and young women, would play on the home front in Japan's full-scale war in China and the Pacific. Primary school children learn about the Kokugo campaign and the Kokugo no Ie, or Japanese language household campaign, in their language lessons during the war. Both campaigns sought to erase Han Taiwanese identity and culture while emphasizing the gender-specific roles that women served in the Kominga process. Next slide, please. In the fourth 1937-42 edition of the language textbook, a second grade lesson titled Kokugo no Ie tells of 2 boys named Michio and Yuichi. Michio visits his friend Yuichi's place on a Sunday. The lesson reveals that Yuichi's grandfather has learned Japanese after attending a Kokugo workshop. It also tells how Yuichi's grandmother, who is unable to go to the workshop because of her weak legs, is learning some Japanese after Yuichi's grandfather started going to the workshop, presumably from her husband. In the lesson, Yuichi's grandfather tells Michio, "From now on, I will study Kokugo with Yuichi. I want to be able to speak Kokugo at home." Upon hearing that Yuichi's parents do speak Kokugo because they completed primary education, Michio's father comments that Yuichi's family will likely become a Kokugo no Ie. The company illustration here shows an elderly man dressed in a Western-style shirt and pants talking to 2 primary school-age boys dressed in school uniforms in front of a brick house. Their outward appearance would be considered modern and fits the image of Japanese subjects. Although both boys have Japanese names, likely part of the name-changing campaign of Kominga, students could infer that Yuichi's family is not ethnically Japanese because ethnic Japanese residing in Taiwan were not targeted to learn Japanese, nor did any Japanese household become Kokugo no Ie, because ethnic Japanese Taiwan were presumed to be loyal Japanese-speaking subjects already. After reading the lesson, second-grade Taiwanese children could tell their elderly parents to attend a Kokugo workshop so that everyone in the family could speak Japanese, as Yuichi's grandfather has done. The Kokugo campaign sought to create Japanese-speaking households, and the basic qualification of this household was that every family member had to be proficient in Japanese before a household could apply for the status. The incentives include a certificate with some privileges, including admission to Japanese elementary schools, priority admission to middle schools, priority hiring in government jobs, and higher chances of obtaining business licenses. This lesson, Kokugo no Ie, from the 4th edition of the language textbook was replaced by grandmother's Kokugo in the final 1943-44 lesson. Next slide, please, which reveals the attention that colonial officials and educators give to assimilating women in the absence of men who were mobilized and away from home during the last years of the war. Hana, the narrator here, also has a Japanese name. Hana talks about the progress that her grandmother has made in learning Japanese. Her grandmother finds asking Hana to help her read a book troublesome in a household where everyone except her is proficient in Japanese. So Hana's grandmother started attending the kokugo workshop with a woman neighbor 3 months ago and has not missed any lessons. Her grandmother is happy to comply with Hana's mother's request to read the telegram that Hana's father has sent from Taipei. Hana's mother then compliments Hana's grandmother. In the color illustration here, we see 3 people sitting on tatami floor, an elderly woman in glasses and a Western style button-up blouse holding a piece of paper. Sitting in the middle. On the left, we have a primary school age girl with short hair in a blue Western dress. And on the right, we have an adult woman in a collared shirt with a sweater. Everyone is dressed in Western clothing, not traditional Han Taiwanese or Japanese clothing, but they are in a Japanese style room. So what we see here is that in the Japanese Empire, a good wife's mother was marked by her Japanese appearance and name and housing, in addition to speaking Japanese. The concept of acquiring Japanese proficiency through the kokugo workshop and seeking an educated grandchild's help with an all-female cast in the final edition of the textbooks suggests that the Kominga movement sought to expand the reach of dōka into Taiwanese homes, continuing the vision colonial officials and educators had had since the early colonial period. dōka had always targeted the home through educated girls and women, and so it was no surprise that the kokugo campaign included a domestic side where women were mobilized to help increase its success. This lesson shows that her family remains in contact with Hana's father through letter writing, which requires Japanese literacy. But though the lesson doesn't specify why Hana's father is away from home, the wartime context suggests that he has been mobilized. And so Japanese proficiency also links the home with those mobilized by the war, in addition to marking one's membership in the Japanese Empire. If school was the main site to learn how to become Japanese, then Taiwanese elderly like Hana's grandmother and Yuichi's grandparents were the only ones left in Taiwan who had not had Japanese schools to attend when they were children. They represent the old Taiwan, and their assimilation would symbolize the success of dōka in Taiwan. Younger generations like Hana and Yuichi could help Japanize the elderly into the empire. And so dōka had expanded to non-school children who would learn Japanese during the war. While the kokugo course was important for training Taiwanese children's minds, training their bodies was equally important in producing loyal and skillful patriots in school. Children in Taiwan received military training, participated in marching and metal recycling, and to be thrifty during the war. Many former schoolgirls recall military training. One interviewee, In Xinrui from a farming household in Taipei told me, "Yeah, we did. It was in 6th grade when we learned how to use bamboo stick to thrust at the enemy." Another interviewee, Xu Guidi, who was the daughter of a tea merchant family in southern Taiwan, remembered in 5th, 6th grade, they also taught us how to use a stick. We yelled, "Yeah, yeah." We thrust the stick at our target. These lessons continue into middle school. Lin Xianyan, the interview who made rice bowls for soldiers that I talked about earlier, also remember receiving military training in middle school. We girls also learn swordship. She said kendo. We use a long knife and learn how to carry and use it. We also receive training on how to use old-style guns from hundreds of years ago. And she sort of laughed at this when she told me. We also use bamboo sticks with sharp ends. We were taught to use them to fight against the Americans if they came, to attack them while wearing white headbands around our heads. We train with the bamboo stick every day. We were taught that the Americans despised us, and if they saw us girls, they would definitely want to violate us. Therefore, we were taught that we had to kill Americans with bamboo sticks. Her narrative of their bamboo spear training echo how the Japanese government portrayed Japan and its enemy during the wartime period. Japanese officials portrayed Japan as the purifying sun or the sword of righteousness, in contrast to the image of the United States and Great Britain as demons who were violent and destructive. The bayonet was seen as the Japanese common man's sword of righteousness, and Japanese government propaganda posters depicted Americans and the British as demons that could be brought down by a bayonet. Instead of a bayonet, Lin, In, and Xu used bamboo spears to practice thrusting at their target. What we see here is that schools require military training to prepare to defend Taiwan and themselves. And in the process of demonizing Americans, Lin's teacher taught them to defend themselves to protect their own chastity. So the lesson had two purposes. One is to imbue schoolgirls with the idea of defending their chastity, and two, to impart military skills on a practical level. The self-defense training that these primary and secondary and middle school girls received also suggests that the colonial government was preparing for an invasion of the home front, including the colony of Taiwan. Youths were mobilized for military training on school grounds and in youth groups. The justification for military training was gendered. Male training to fight for one's country, and female training to defend one's virtue and to support the war effort. While military training focused more on fighting, next slide. While military training focused more on fighting or defending oneself against the external enemy, physical education have been important since the early colonial period as a way to create healthy national subjects. And it came to reinforce men's role on the home front and women's role on the men's role on the front line and women's role on the home front during the war. Physical education included marching, the basic training of group coordination, and dumbbell exercises. The course was complemented with outside class activities such as walking tours, field trips, and hiking. In 1937, a teacher's manual on physical education for all primary level schools included gender-specific lessons. We see here one illustration from that manual. So boys only activities involve using one's strength and competing against an opponent, both as individual and team exercises. These exercises sought to increase a boy's physical strength to fight against an enemy alone and collectively, which were skills necessary to fight on the front line. In contrast, in the image here, girls' only exercises of marching, dancing, and singing emphasize collective, uniform coordination. One of my interviewees, Wu Shurong, the daughter of a woodcraft factory owner in northern Taiwan, remembered that as fourth or fifth grader, she and her classmates participated in lantern parades whenever Japan won a battle. She recalled that students had to wear uniforms and meet on the school grounds. Their teacher then led them to downtown for the victory parade. They held lanterns and sang military songs while marching around the downtown area for about an hour. To show their patriotism and thrift, students were also mobilized to participate in metal recycling program during the war. In September 1942, the colonial government requested that residents in Taiwan donate metals for weapon production, including copper, iron, copper mixed gold, aluminum, white gold, tin, lead, diamond, and gold. People were forced to donate items such as postal boxes, billboards, copper statues, metal doors, temple bells, metal fencing, and streetlights. Taiwanese women were especially sad to sell their jewelry, usually part of their dowries, to the government at a low price. One interviewee, Li Piqing, recalled a metal collection assignment. Her teacher gave them a vacation assignment to collect glass bottles, metal nails, iron, and anything that could be made into bombs. She told me we would get points for objects we collected and submitted to her. Each item was assigned a point value. We did it for 2 consecutive years. Next slide, please. Schoolgirls also perform many tasks in the agricultural sector as temporary workers inside and outside school ground. Taiwan became an important grain supplier within the Japanese Empire because of the intensifying industrialization and urbanization in the metropole. and also an increasing large military because of military conscription, the redirection of resources to the military, and droughts in Korea and the Kansai area in Western Japan in 1939. So an interviewee again, Lin Xianyan, remembered that her middle school required students to plant crops. On the school grounds, we planted yams, vegetables, and even carried fertilizers. I learned how to plant crops from that time period. Another interviewee, Ying Xingrui from Taipei, still remember the sickening experience of picking out Asiatic rice borers, worms that feed on the stem of rice plants, with her classmates in the field as a primary school student. I couldn't find a good photo of girls or women working on a farm, but here's a photo showing us some youth group members cutting down bamboo in Hsinchu in central Taiwan. Next slide, please. Schoolgirls were also mobilized to participate in the creation of sending buddy, 1,000-person stitches in Japanese, another symbol of women's gender role during the wartime period. Seen here on the left, sending buddy were white pieces of cloth with red stitches sewn on them, supposedly by 1,000 women. Created during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-05, sending buddy represented 1,000 women's good wishes for the soldiers. Generally speaking, the phrase "continue luck in the fortunes of war" and the image of a tiger were sewn on the cloth, but we don't see tiger in this photo here. The tiger image representing a safe return came from a Japanese proverb. A tiger will return home safely even when it travels far away. In October 1941, Taiwan Daily News declared that Taiwanese women had embraced this activity for the sake of the empire. Here on the right is a photo from that report. The report emphasized that each stitch on the sending buddy came to represent the unity of all women on the home front. All female residents of the empire, young and old, could be asked to sew one stitch on the cloth, likely because they were expected to have received homemaking training in school. Many Taiwanese schoolgirls and young working women recall sewing stitches on sending buddy. So for example, Wu Shurong recalled making sending buddy outside the school grounds when she was a primary school girl. Li Piqing recalled that some students hand-tied the finished sending buddy to soldiers who were actually teachers from her primary school in Taipei. So schoolgirls who started learning to sew in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th grade were excellent candidates for the sending buddy project because it tied them to the war effort. Next slide. So here we see a photo of a sewing lesson at a primary school in southern Taiwan, Tainan. During the war, sewing became not only a feminine skill, but also a patriotic one, linking an individual act of sewing a piece of clothing to a collective activity for the empire. Because only girls and women could participate, sending buddy symbolized Japanese feminine patriotism and created a feminine communal space where female friends and strangers came together to make this their going away lucky charm for soldiers. We see that wartime mobilization redefined gender assimilation in colonial Taiwan as it shifted the training and focus of good wives, wise mothers from the individual households only to the entire empire, which meant that schoolgirls were training to become good wives, wise mothers of the empire. It was no longer sufficient for schoolgirls and women to keep their individual homes strong and healthy. They had to work together to keep the empire strong and healthy, both mentally and physically. They do this by showing their support through patriotic activities and mobilized labor. And in the process of receiving spiritual and physical training and participating in agricultural production and patriotic activities, schoolgirls became Japanese imperial subjects. So my talk today focuses on what Japanese officials did in Taiwan. Although colonial officials used race and ethnicity as the main markers of political and socioeconomic hierarchy, I argue that gender remained the most powerful and persistent defining marker of colonial hierarchy. And my book emphasizes the importance of gender in understanding assimilation and not just looking at race or ethnicity that many studies on assimilation in empire study in East Asia and elsewhere have focused on. I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.